Please pray with me. Gracious God, let us dwell together in peace. And let us not be instruments of our own or others' oppression. And now may the words of my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts nourish our minds, encourage our hearts, and strengthen our spirits. God, our source and our sustainer. Amen. You heard a moment ago from Chris some statistics about the global and U.S. numbers as far as the people who are living with HIV and AIDS. I heard that approximately 1.2, 1.3 million people are living with HIV and AIDS in the United States. And after years of plummeting new infection rates, for the last 6 years, infection rates have plateaued. They're no longer decreasing. They average about 38,000 new transmissions a year since about 2013. The U.S. government recently inaugurated its Ending the HIV and AIDS Epidemic Campaign, EHE, I think they're calling it. And this is also the U.S.'s theme for this year's World AIDS Day observance, Ending HIV/AIDS Epidemic. And this campaign seeks to reduce new transmissions by 90% by the year 2030. This year, the National Institutes for Health and the CDC and other U.S. agencies are focusing on a strategy to end the epidemic, and they're calling it, quote, community by community. The idea is that unique communities, particularly those at high risk for HIV infection, bring to bear their own bodies of knowledge, their own wisdom, their own experience necessary for eradicating HIV transmission in those respective communities. In other words, our stories, our experiences, and our engagements regarding HIV and AIDS as LGBTQIA+ communities are essential to our long-standing work to free ourselves from the ongoing clutches of this virus. And of course, we have our stories to tell. Our experiences that we have lived through dealing with the reality of HIV/AIDS in our LGBTQIA+ communities. This morning, I would like to share some of my story and experiences. And maybe you will find that it connects in some meaningful way to your own. Certainly, we should see how it connects to our collective story. Our two scripture readings for this morning, taken from the lectionary for World AIDS Day for this year, offer several focal points for my reflection as I share. The gospel reading is a familiar parable from the Jesus tradition. The story is ostensibly about poor Lazarus and an unnamed rich man. But truthfully, the story is more about the unnamed rich man than it is Lazarus. Indeed, Lazarus has no voice at all in this story. Though his voiceless suffering and ultimate redemption in many ways make him the most compelling character in the parable. Psalm 6 is a cry of lament. If Lazarus were allowed to speak in our parable, we might very well imagine the words of this psalm pouring forth from his mouth as he lay in anguish, covered in sores, near death, uncared for, his humanity unacknowledged in his suffering. Yes, it is easy to see from the start how these two passages connect to the lived human reality that lay behind the vaguely ominous moniker, the AIDS epidemic. I became HIV positive in October of 2004. But if I'm being totally honest with you, 9 years earlier, in the fall of 1993, for one excruciating week, I had full-blown AIDS. Now, before you start challenging me on the scientific impossibility of that, I fully acknowledge that my body was not in any way afflicted with AIDS-related illnesses or a problematically low T-cell count. But my mind, my psyche, my fragile 20-year-old emotional makeup was in fact being devastated, ravaged by AIDS for the entire 7 days it took for the county health department to process the results of the very first HIV test I ever took. I was in Bible college at the time, and though I had a serious girlfriend, I had been having sexual encounters with another male student for several months. How that got out into the open is a story for a different time. But it did get out, and I had to tell my girlfriend about it. We decided that the first thing that we had to do was to go get ourselves tested for HIV. As difficult as it was actually going to get tested, the 7-day waiting period proved to be unbearable. We had nothing to do for that week but ruminate on how nearly certain it was that we had in fact contracted AIDS as a result of my actions, and that we were likely going to die within a few years. We worried. We couldn't sleep. We spent hours upon hours praying for God to miraculously take the AIDS out of our bodies. The best day of our respective lives up to that point was when we found out a week later that we were both HIV negative. We were sure that God had stepped in and performed a miracle. After all, the other young man and I had touched each other's genitals on 6 different occasions. And 2 of those times, there had even been a few minutes of oral sex between us. And though my girlfriend and I had never done anything sexual, we had kissed an awful lot. So obviously, there was no way we could have avoided both being HIV positive without that divine intervention. As ridiculously ill-informed as I was in 1993, at the very least, I was aware of just how devastating HIV/AIDS was to real people's lives at that age. Less than a decade earlier, in middle school, as a young teenager, I was completely oblivious to the suffering. Oh, I knew that there was a disease called AIDS, and I knew that it was something that gay men got. But I was completely ignorant and unmindful of what those gay men and their loved ones were going through. To me and my friends, it was just another thing in the news about which to make jokes. And that's what we did. I can remember telling what I thought were the cleverest, funniest jokes about gay men and AIDS on the schoolyard. In truth, they were heartless, even vile as I think about them now. They do not bear repeating, but I still feel shame to this moment whenever I relive those particular memories. At the same time that I was making my jokes, my cousin Bob, whom I had never even known about until years later, was slowly and agonizingly dying of AIDS-related complications. My Aunt Brenda had 2 sons, Bob and Dale, and both were gay young men in the 1980s. Now, she lived in a small town in South Dakota, and she didn't hardly know what to make of that fact. When Bob got sick, she had no choice but to become educated real fast. She cared for Bob, faithfully at his side as he suffered, helpless in the face of his cries. With the psalmist, "Have mercy on me, God. My strength is gone. Heal me. I am afraid. I am full of anguish." And when Bob could no longer speak, she and Dale cried out with the psalmist in his stead. "I am exhausted from crying. I flood my bed with tears. I am nearly blind with grief." My Aunt Brenda had to be stronger than she knew she could be in those days. She had to advocate for Bob. She had to ensure his access to care in the face of those, including medical professionals, who could not bring themselves to so much as touch her son. Like Lazarus covered in sores, Bob's Kaposi sarcoma was the scarlet A that rendered him untouchable, less than human. What would Lazarus have said, I wonder, if he could hear the rich man beg Abraham and Sarah to allow him to drink from Lazarus' fingertips? Would he have thought of all the times the man had pointedly avoided him as he passed, not deigning to even acknowledge him, much less touch him in any way? Surely Lazarus was a man who had become used to being denied human touch. Now Abraham and Sarah rebuffed the rich man's request, telling him he is getting what he has coming to him. I wonder, though, if Lazarus might have been deeply affected by the request, by the man's willingness to have Lazarus touch him in so intimate a way after having been untouchable for so long. As Brenda tells it, the rare stranger, nurse, aide, who would lovingly exchange human touch with Bob, became one of the few blessings she learned to cherish in those days. She could get angry at all those who would not touch her son, and she did for a time. But after a while, she found it better for her own spirit to focus on those who did not let fear blind them to Bob's humanity. Reading in my aunt's biographical account of Bob's illness and death about so many people not wanting to touch him made me think of an event that had made the news a year earlier. In 1995, President Clinton invited a group of openly gay elected officials to the White House as an outreach effort to the community. This was the first time an openly gay group had ever been invited to the White House. This historic moment was marred when several of the White House security staff chose to put on rubber gloves, quote unquote, for our own protection, before conducting routine inspections of the guests' personal effects upon their arrival. Though HIV/AIDS is not and never was a gay disease, this incident highlighted the fact that in the broader U.S. consciousness at least, the reality as well as the myths concerning the virus are inextricably connected to our community. Though most of us are personally affected by HIV/AIDS in some way, the truth is that as LGBTQIA plus people, we are publicly and socially impacted, whatever our personal experience may be. One of the points of pride I take in being part of MCC is how our leaders, clergy and lay people alike, stepped up in those early days and provided care in the place of those who could not bring themselves to touch people with AIDS. Reverend Elder Pat Bumgarner tells how she and other leaders at MCC New York had to learn to be actual nurses in real time because so many of their parishioners and others in the community were not able to find nurses who would care for them. We didn't know what we were doing, MCC, but we learned fast because we had people who needed us, who needed to know they deserved to be cared for by virtue of their innate human dignity. And we learned to be housing advocates as well. Reverend Pat recalls the days when landlords would evict tenants when they discovered that they had AIDS. Leases would not be renewed. Surviving spouses were equally vulnerable to being tossed out on the street after it was discovered their partners had died of AIDS. Before support agencies were formed, before we began to act up as a community, before official resources existed, MCC was one of a handful of established community organizations that found itself in the position to make a difference for those with AIDS and their loved ones. And we did. My cousin Bob was one of those who lost his apartment when it became known that he was very sick. Much like Lazarus, he too might have ended up homeless and left to die in the streets. But my Aunt Brenda was not going to let that happen. She relocated to the city where he lived and brought him home to care for him there. When Bob died, Brenda took his body back home to the town he had grown up in South Dakota. She made funeral arrangements at the church she had long been a member of, the church Bob had grown up in. She asked Bob's friends from the city whom she had come to know and love in the time that she had cared for him to please come to the funeral. Send Lazarus to be a warning to them so they may not end up in this place of torment. I always wondered why the rich man would want Lazarus to be the warning to others. Wouldn't the rich man whose callous living had earned him torment make the better warning? The pastor of that church, Brenda and Bob's family pastor, he would have made a better warning, a more fit cautionary tale. And the people at the funeral who stood in callous judgment of my cousin would have been the more appropriate recipients of that warning. But as with the rich man, this pastor got it mixed up. He took the occasion of my cousin's funeral in the presence of his grieving mother, a member of his own congregation, to use Bob as a cautionary tale for the benefit of Bob's friends, his gay family of choice, who had come to grieve him. Bob had received within himself the due penalty of his perversion and was now truly suffering in torment. Bob's death and eternal damnation could yet have some meaning, however, some higher purpose, if it could only lead his friends away from their destructive lifestyle. Of course, his friends were no more inclined to listen to that trash than the rich man's family would heed any warning they might receive. They saw the pastor as the heartless bigot that he was and dismissed him out of hand. And of course, Bob wasn't trouble. He was already on the other side of the chasm, resting with Sarah and Abraham. But Brenda was incredibly angry, hurt, and betrayed. And it took her a number of years to find her way back into a church after that. If only Brenda had known about MCC. In cities across the U.S. and beyond, MCC churches were once again standing in the gap to make sure that those whose loved ones had died of AIDS did not have the experience of rejection and derision at the hands of their trusted faith communities. Reverend Darrell Watkins, my boss down at Sunshine Cathedral, tells of the dozens and dozens of funerals he officiated while the AIDS chaplain at Cathedral of Hope MCC in Dallas, Texas. Time and time again, he found himself marshaling the resources of that church to provide a safe, powerful, fitting memorial and send-off for families who had nowhere else to turn. He hadn't known most of them beforehand. They simply needed someone, someplace, that would say, yes, your loved one deserves the dignity of a sacred goodbye, and so do you. We are MCC, and we are here for you. I wish that my Aunt Brenda had been able to have this experience as she said goodbye to her son, who had not yet reached 30 years of age. It pains me even now to know that she was denied this. But I am filled with joy when I think of how many families, how many grieving parents, how many siblings, friends, families of choice saw their loved honored by an MCC congregation committed to providing a fitting funeral service for someone taken too soon by AIDS. I think it's good that we share stories like these from our MCC heritage, from our own lived personal experience, from our families and our families of choice. In fact, I think that it's more than good. I believe that these stories and the experiences they speak of have creative power. They create hopefulness. They create realities that are themselves innately more hopeful. Because my Aunt Brenda told her story in a book, I was able to read that book and draw from it the courage to finally come out as a gay man and live my truth. Because my cousin Bob suffered as he did at a time where there was little grace and even fewer answers when it came to HIV/AIDS, the groundwork was laid. Unlike Lazarus, those who suffered and died found their voice, even if only in death, and used it to ensure that people on the other side of what once had seemed like an insurmountable chasm indeed took heed, and at long last began to commit themselves to addressing this epidemic. Because my cousin Bob suffered and died in the 1980s, I was able to go on a cocktail treatment immediately upon seroconverting in 2004, which has allowed me to maintain an undetectable viral load for the better part of 15 years, and which has given me every reason for confident hopefulness that my life and the lives of so many others living with HIV need not be any less full on account of that. Because of the stories shared and struggles experienced around the world, global infection rates continue to decline every year. Even in the places we are most prone to forget, the people we are most likely to step over and not even see as they lay suffering at our gates. Before moving to South Florida, I served as a clergy counselor for a yearly camp retreat for people living with HIV/AIDS in the mountains of Southern California. It's a Methodist camp called Strength for the Journey. And I worked with an amazing woman there, a silver-haired retired teacher named Carla, who walked with great difficulty due to a degenerative spinal condition that had hunched over her back, and every year she was just a little bit lower to the ground. Carla had helped start that camp some 20 years earlier. And she had not missed a single year in that time. Every year, at the urging of returning campers, she would tell the story at the opening campfire for the benefit of the new campers about the bracelet she wore and was never seen without. That first year, a considerably ill camper had made her the bracelet during a craft workshop, 1992. She loved it and began wearing it immediately. Shortly after camp, she received word that the camper had died. And she vowed that she would never take out that bracelet again until a cure for AIDS was found. This vow has allowed her not only to encourage campers every year at the retreat, but to talk about HIV/AIDS with her students, colleagues, fellow churchgoers, family, everyone she knows who notices the bracelet that's always on her arm. When campers ask if she gets discouraged after 20 plus years that there is still no cure, she says, not at all. When I first put on this bracelet, she says, I thought that until a cure was found, it would serve only as a heart-wrenching reminder of the people I knew who had died whenever I looked at it. And in those first years of doing this camp, that's pretty much what it was. People came here to find strength for their journey toward death. They came here for respite and to find some peace before they died. In those early years, more campers from the year before had died than were back for another year of camp, year after year. But over time, that changed. Even now, we still have a camper die from AIDS-related illnesses every year or two. She says, but this is now a camp where people come to relax, to recharge, to bask in the freedom that comes from being in an environment where being HIV positive is blessedly normal, even if only for a week. Now people come here to find strength for the journey of living with HIV, not dying from it. And now, when I look at this bracelet, she says, I see not only the faces of the many friends I have lost to this disease, but I see the faces of the many friends I have made and cannot wait to see again next year. I know a cure for HIV is coming, but I celebrate the cure we have already realized. She says, we have cured our hopelessness. We have cured our despair. We have cured our fear of truly living. This morning, I think the U.S. government is surprisingly right on the money. The key to wiping out HIV/AIDS is rooted in community. For whatever reason, and not by choice, our community has become one of the primary faces of this virus. It is our unique work to not only make sense of the reality of HIV/AIDS, but to ensure that it never again manages to rob us of our hope or to leave us in despair. As LGBTQIA+ people, as part of the ongoing heritage of metropolitan community churches, this community, our community, has the incredible opportunity to prove this terrible wrong. That is, through the power of our stories and experiences, past and present, to reach across the seemingly impassable chasm and allow those who come after us to learn from our journey, from our anguish, as well as our hard-earned rest, so that stigma, inequities in treatment access, barriers to prevention strategies, and ultimately HIV/AIDS itself will become a thing of the past. Yes, I like to think that if we could hear Lazarus in this parable, we might find that he surprisingly has taken issue with Abraham and Sarah. He might share from his own story, his own experience, that he has come to believe that no torment is everlasting, that the hope of refreshment is never impossibly inaccessible. Yes, perhaps he might find his voice in the psalmist, not merely in the cry of anguish and lament, but in that defiant hopefulness rooted in the assurance of God's faithful response. And we surely have cause to join our communal voice to theirs as we say with the psalmist and Lazarus together, Get away from us violence. Get away from us despair. Get away from us hopelessness and bitterness. For God has heard our cries, has been moved by our stories, and has accepted our prayers. And this, on World AIDS Day and every day, is always the good news.